Champaign County Agriculture Today with your host, Dennis Riggs.
Hello and welcome to Champaign County Agriculture Today. My name is Dennis Riggs, your host for the next half hour as we take a look at some interesting aspects of agriculture here in Champaign County. Now you may be saying agriculture, how does this affect me? Well, of course, here in Champaign County, agriculture is one of the main industries and a big employer in the production of a lot of raw materials. So with us today is we're going to talk about the beginning of agriculture. We're going to be talking some dirt here on Champaign County Agriculture Today and how it affects you. I have two excellent guests in the dirt/soils department today, and that is Howard Brown and Emerson Nafzinger. So we want to start off and introduce you gentlemen and help us explore more how soils are important to all of us here at East Central Illinois. Emerson, I'll start with you at the university. Give us a little background of how you're involved with the soils here in Champaign County.
Well, I'm a crops agronomist for the University of Illinois, so I cover the whole state, but of course I live in Champaign County, and so it's of special interest to me here. And crops wouldn't be anything without the soil they grow in, and that's why I'm interested in soils.
Now, have you been from a farm originally, or been with the university for a long time? What's your background there?
I grew up in a farm, on a farm in the state of Ohio, and not so different than northern Illinois, and did agronomy degrees, including one here at the University of Illinois, and have been here for about 25 years now talking about crops in Illinois.
Very good. Well, thank you for being with us today.
Glad to be here.
Our next guest today is Howard Brown. Howard is the manager of agronomy services of Growmark over in Bloomington. Of course, Growmark, a company that extends across the Midwest here. Howard, give us a little background of where you're from and how you're involved in the agricultural scene.
Okay, well, I started being raised on a farm, cash grain, livestock, small farm compared to standards now, and went to school, wanted to stay close to agriculture, and so I went to Southern Illinois University, spent a little time, and went to Purdue, and finally ended up in the school of choice there at the University of Illinois. Had a chance to work with Emerson. My job is manager of agronomy services, so I help manage the technical team that looks over aspects of Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin agriculture.
Very good. Well, both of you jump and bring a great background to our discussion today. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering why they should be interested in dirt. After all, it's something we clean off the windowsill in the kitchen. It's something we brush out of the bottom of the trunk of the car. Emerson, is there a difference between that dirt that's on the windowsill of the kitchen window when it's been open one afternoon and the soils that we farm in?
Well, in this case, I think, Dennis, the only difference is where they are, because that dirt was in a field somewhere, something dislodged it, and it came in on the wind and deposited on your windowsill. So in that case, no. We would, although at the same time, we'd have to say that going back several thousand years in this area, we had dirt blow in fact, and our topsoil that we farm and are so proud of here in Champaign County really started out as a deposit given us by the wind, and the soil then developed in these deposits. Mm-hmm. So anywhere you go around the world, you see soils, and these soils are a product of sort of chemical and physical and biological processes over usually thousands or even millions of years that have brought it to the state that it is today.
Well, of course, soils have a long history, and it's something that we try to protect as far as it's the livelihood of Champaign County and East Central Illinois farms. Well, Howard, is more soil being formed today? Is this something that just happened years ago and we've got all we're going to get, or is there fresh soil being born?
Soil is very dynamic. The thing is about soil that it occurs over a period of time that's really not known to us. It's geologic time, so it's a long scale. Soils are formed in thousands of years versus what we're familiar with. So it is being formed all the time. We're losing soil and we're gaining soil.
Mm-hmm. Emerson, in the backyard of many people in town, I've heard of they have compost pits. Are they making soil when you have a compost pit, or they have their own garden where they put debris from their last year's crop over top? Is that making soil?
Well, I'd say they're making a component of soil. The organic matter is a very important part of soil. But the base of soil, once it starts to form, it's mineral and it basically ground up rock. And that's what soil then forms in. And the soil formation is what happens to that ground up rock over many, many years. Mm-hmm. Part of that is the growth of grass, the growth of microorganisms. There's a lot of biological activity that goes into making that soil and is also in the soil. And so when we make compost and do things to add to our soil, we're simply improving that or increasing the percentage of that. And organic matter is important because it's what sort of makes our soils productive. It gives them the texture, it makes them farmable and makes them highly productive. And so one of the reasons that people came here and saw the black soil was the organic matter that's there. And it's around the world, darker the soil, the more potential people see it as having, and that's because of the organic matter that's there.
We are truly blessed here in East Central Illinois and across the Corn Belt with that dark, deep, rich soil that allows us to grow abundant food and fiber. Not necessarily all of the world is soil. There's a lot of this world that is not soil. Howard, I believe you brought an apple along. Is that for dessert? Or I think you've got a little demonstration there you'd like to show us about productivity.
Well, thank you. And if anybody does get hungry, eat it, but for the purpose of the example, if you think about the land mass of the world, or the world itself, think of it as an apple, and we know that of the world, 3/4 of it is covered by water, 1/4 is covered by land. So let's take this pre-cut apple, so I don't show how I cut myself. So we'll take 1/4.
So there goes the water.
Now the water's sitting on the table. You have to get a towel because we'll have a mess. So here's 1/4 of land mass. Now the 1/4 land mass, it's not all usable land. So of that 1/4 that's left, half of that probably we can't use. It's the mountains, it's the tundra, it's the ice fields. So let's just take this and take 1/2 of that away because we can't use that part.
The non-productive soils that are not, can't grow crops in it.
No.
Okay, all right.
Now we've got land that we can do something with, but hey, wait a minute. We can't farm all that land. So let's break that up into 4 segments. Because of that land that's left, we have land that's in buildings, we have land that's non-productive soils, deserts, and we also have water still on that land mass. It's not part of the ocean.
Lakes, streams.
Sure, we can't farm. So we have one piece left. I think you'd call this 1/32 of the apple. Now wait a minute, that's the land, but we don't farm that whole segment of soil or that land. We only farm the surface. So if you look at this, and if you peel off, which this is where cutting my finger comes into play.
Try to be careful.
Sure.
There we go.
And you do have liability insurance.
Yes, we do.
Okay. This of an apple, this is how much represented land mass that we actually work with to produce food to feed the world's population. Very small part. So, and that's why it's so important that we need to focus on how we manage it to the utmost to get the most out of it and preserve its use for future generations.
Well, an excellent example, and a little scary example, when you can think of the entire world's population being supported basically by that much topsoil and that kind of growth. That right there. Thanks, Howard. It was great. Well, Emerson, with just this little bit to grow our crops in, how can we keep this productive? How can we make sure that this amount of land, small amount as it is, can grow the crops to feed the world?
That answer really changes as you move around. Every soil has some set of drawbacks to it. Drainage, good drainage is a deficiency. Some soils are very poorly drained. When they're poorly drained, that means there's too much water in them for plants to grow well. And I always look at soils from a crop standpoint, so I'm seeing what the soil is seeing when it's there. And in Champaign County, one of the first efforts that had to be made was to drain the soils. They were simply not very productive, and people had bypassed them when they came here. The Europeans came to settle. They had bypassed this because it was so poorly drained. So that's one of them. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but we need to get air into the soil to make it a productive soil.
I think we've got a slide on that, slide number 10 we're going to look at here in just a little bit. I don't think people understand the network of drainage systems that farmers have installed over the last 200 years here in East Central Illinois to do that. And we'll take a look at that in just a second.
The other thing, of course, is when we talk about maintaining the productivity and farming them carefully, the first thing we have to worry about in sloping areas, and Champaign County is not a very sloping area, but we do have slopes. water runs down these slopes, and if we've loosened that soil, plowed it, tilled it, it can certainly run down the slope with the water and into the streams. And our rivers in Illinois generally carry a lot of silt that came out of the fields, and that's always a concern. And so we need to do things that try to keep the soil in its place, keep it from running off in water, and it also blows off into the air, but with wind, and we always worry about that as well. But losing it by water is one of the things that happens.
Slide number 10 that we're looking here is a drainage system that a farmer has installed, and it shows that tile are laid out in a somewhat logistical manner, and it's not just haphazard across the field. You might explain what that farmer has done with that tile system.
Well, most of our tile today is plastic, and the farmer had a machine that would install plastic tile to different depths, depending a little bit on the topography of the field. This field that you see here is very flat, and so the tile is probably at a fairly uniform depth, but they've made a system there that will drain the soil on either side of those tiles, and how much it will drain is dependent on the soil type. But here in this area, typically soil or tile lines are put maybe 80 to 100 feet apart, and then they'll drain that area in between that and make it much more productive then for crops.
When a tile is going into the field, I know I have as a farmer have seen some of this, the soil is not the same color, Howard, as you start at the top and it's black and then it goes to different colors. Is that different types of dirt or different types of soil? What makes that color change from top to bottom?
When we talked earlier, we talked about how soils are formed and what length of time it takes. And when I mentioned geologic time, that's essentially what's going on. And what you see is the environment's influence on how the soil was formed over time. So for example, water leaching through a profile takes with it some organic matter, and in those areas where we have a lot of water, the humid Midwest, we actually can migrate organic matter further into the profile, giving us a dark upper horizon, such as the common soils we have here in Illinois. In some other areas where you don't have that water, you don't have the migration of organic matter, you don't have a lot of the activity in soil formation, so it stays more relatively the same, such as in the deserts or the more arid environments.
Does that take into account, like say for example, you don't have to go too far south in Indiana and get down in Kentucky, where there are, as you're driving along some of the fields down there, a lot lighter soil and sometimes very red type of soils too. Now what happened there?
Well, we're blessed in Illinois because we had over historic time, and we had glaciers come in and level us off and recede and then come level us off. We've in fact had 4 glaciers affect us in Illinois. However, when you get down to a line across central part of Illinois, Pana, so forth, not all the glaciers made it there. So the ground is a little more rough, a little more terrain, a little older soil. And when you get to the very southern tip of Illinois where it's beautiful, beautiful hills, trees, the glaciers didn't make it that far, so those soils are extremely old because they've been with us for that whole period of time. Weathering and the climate has changed them compared to what we have in our area here.
Well, that makes it pretty unique around the Midwest here.
That's right.
Well, those good soils, Emerson, I know you said you like to think of how the crop looks at soil. Is there a reason that in East Central Illinois we grow mainly corn and soybeans? Do they match the soil, or is it just the seed just happen to show up here?
It's probably a combination of things. Certainly people brought corn with them, and it's been an important crop in Illinois for well over 100 years. So that's one that came, and it was a crop that could be planted out there fairly easily compared to the small grains, for example. You could sort of plant it out there on hills and go out and harvest a good crop from it. And it had large seed, and it transported fairly easily. So that's one reason that people brought that crop with them. And it's, I suppose the fact that it's so popular today is a combination of us starting with that crop, and also as that crop has gotten bred and improved and developed, it's that's always influenced by the environment that you do that in. And so I'd say by now, after all of this time of improving corn, it's really sort of found its home here, and it's kind of adapted to that home. And so we've probably kind of maximized that system and are keeping it that way by continued efforts of farmers like yourself and of the breeders and so on. Soybean is a much more recent arrival and really has been an important crop in Illinois only for 50 years or so. But it's taken its place there. It turned out to be a very good sort of rotation crop with corn. And so the mix, as we did away with our rotations after the 40s or so, soybean came in and replaced a lot of that had been in hay and so on. We didn't need oats for horses anymore, and so soybean has found a real market in the world. It's the leading oilseed protein source combination that's produced in the world, and it's traded very widely now. So soybean, unlike corn, which has been an important crop for hundreds of years, it was important to the people that were here before the Europeans arrived. And so corn is one that would call Illinois home. Soybeans are more recent immigrant, but they've found a very good pairing here in Illinois.
Over years, and Howard, you've mentioned the fact that soil, it's hard for us to think about it in just recent terms because it is so old. It's been around since dirt. I've been waiting all day to say that. Yes. Sorry. But who keeps track of this study? I mean, are there soil police? Are there, who are the people that are investigating soil, understanding it better, and learning how agriculture can make better use of the soils we have? Who's in charge of that?
Some very, very old people.
Old as dirt, right?
That's right. No, but what we have, we're well blessed to have a good academic system, especially in Illinois and land-grant university. And we have soil scientists that constantly evaluate soils. In fact, have delivered all the information we have to date. They've identified the soil types, such as the Illinois state soil, which is, we'll talk about that, maybe drummer, silty clay loam. That was just named from Ford County back in, I think it was 1929. So they've went as far as giving us the information as far as learning what the soils do, classifying them as far as similarities and things that are alike so that we can understand different soils and how they grow our crops.
Has soil technology changed over the last few years? I know we're paying a lot more attention to it now because we know how important it is in the ecostructure, but has what farmers do to harvest and to reap the crops from their soil, has that changed much over the years?
Oh, yes. Back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when we've turned the first soil with the first plow, we've learned a lot. And since the turn of the century, the beginning of the 1900s, we've learned conservation practices. We had the onset of the Conservation Service, and with practicing conservation, we've learned to better manage the soil by slowing the loss of organic matter, slowing down the loss of soil overall, using more residue management, less tillage to keep the soil where it's at. As Emerson said, erosion is a big factor. Trying to minimize the loss of the most fertile part, the organic matter as well. Fertilizing the soil so we don't continuously drain the soil of its natural nutrition and replacing it with supplemental crop nutrients, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And so yes, there's been a lot of practices. And then precision farming, site-specific management, putting on fertilizer and limestone where it's needed in the field to maximize production in those areas so we can produce more food on less acres.
Emerson, over at the university, I know there's a lot of work being done in all areas of agriculture. What's going on in the areas of soil? What can the university and the academic world help us learn more about soils?
One thing that people see coming out of the soil scientists at the University of Illinois are the revisions in the soil types, the evaluation of farmland. These things are constantly changing, and there have been some changes in that. On a more basic level, we're always trying to study what practices it is that, say, for example, we've talked a lot about carbon sequestration in recent years. That's a big word that means that people are looking to the soil as a place to sort of store carbon that comes from carbon dioxide in the air and try to offset some of the fossil fuel burning. Well, these are not easy things to measure, they're easy things to comprehend, and so it's a fairly sophisticated approach that you need to take to do that, and that's one of the things we're doing. In my case, I'm working a lot, including working with Howard and looking at nitrogen fertilizer management in our soils. It's one of the critical parts of our production of our corn crop, and we have to get that one right. we've been concerned about nitrogen getting to the water as well as the silt getting in the water that I talked about earlier. And we need to get the right rate of nitrogen on the crops so that it doesn't end up going down the Mississippi River.
How would you answer people that say that we're wearing the soil out or the soil's not going to last? Are we doing a better job?
It's an interesting question because everyone has their own way to think about soil. I think most people think about it at least to some extent. And I've heard people say, well, my soil is dead, it's just, and I ask them what yield they got last year, and usually in this part of Illinois, that's a pretty high number. And I guess one way to look at it is if it yields pretty well, it must have something okay with it. And I think that we've probably sounded the alarm maybe a little too much on the ruination that's happening to soil. And a lot of people try to tie it into herbicides, fertilizers, this kind of thing. And that's, at least if you look at all of the evidence out there over the long run, our yields are going up. And I think that's a testimony to the fact that people are managing the soil well. Certainly everyone wants to avoid doing any kind of damage to the soil. And so the fine points of the debate are sort of lost in that. But if our soils were truly in the trouble that some people would put them, I don't know how we'd be producing a crop today.
That's kind of important, too, as we try to maintain the food supply. Howard, I know you work with farmers all across the state of Illinois. The work that you see them do as far as soil productivity, what's on the horizon? What's coming new that they may be trying in the very near future to utilize that soil resource more efficiently?
Well, I would say the one technology, and there's a lot of technologies coming, and it's just we have to find out which one is going to deliver the most return for the least cost, whether it be economical or environmental. But I would say the technology that's the most exciting is transgenic technology that's coming in delivered through seed, and specifically is the root growth of corn plants, and the new trait that's being introduced to resist rootworm feeding, for example, is allowing corn roots to go deeper into the profile, explore more of the profile where there's nutrition as well as water. So that one trait alone, I think, will change the complexion near term of agriculture.
When you say a soil profile, is that, how can you tell what a profile is? Is that like looking at it sideways, like a profile of a face? Or tell me more about what a profile is.
A soil profile is actually digging a hole and looking at a cross-section vertically of the soil. And you'll see, like you mentioned earlier.
Right behind you, and you can see it, folks can see it in the picture there, that would be what you would get if you dug a hole down in the dirt, right?
There would be colors,
yeah,
changes. And when we look at the profile, what we end up with is the roots can explore a certain part. The organic, the part that's the most fertile is in the upper horizon, the upper 10, 12 inches, and that's where the roots will explore. But if you don't have roots to explore, you won't get the food or the water. So the technology is allowing the corn roots to go deeper, have more exploration, get water in the drier parts of the year when normally we don't have that water, and that's what I'm excited to see coming.
Emerson, let's talk about our city cousins for just a moment. We've talked a lot about the agricultural side. I know as we see site development, towns growing, buildings being built, I see some changes in the way contractors and developers are looking at soil. Do you get into much of that, like soil retention, erosion protection?
Well, personally, not very much. But it's, soil is a kind of a unique substance, and you can go to the store and buy a bag of topsoil now, and you can see big piles of soil where people are starting construction, and they're often scraping off at least some of that topsoil. And some people end up with their backyard not being the most productive topsoil that was there before the house was started built.
A good question. I got to stop you at that because I know a lot of people sometimes buy this house and they have a beautiful black soil in the back, but then they go dig to put a post in, and it's only about 2 or 3 inches deep, and they run into something that doesn't look like the good black dirt they thought they had. What happened there?
Well, that got mechanically removed, and some got put back on, but not as much as was there in the first place. And soil like that gets disturbed, it can still be productive, but often in the situations like you described, one has to wait for, a couple hundred years probably until it's back to the sort of productivity it was before. Grass will grow there, and that's usually the main emphasis that people have, sometimes not very well or not when you turn the water off, but as long as the grass looks green, people don't have much reason to look at that soil. But it's sort of one thing that strikes people where they live pretty commonly, and including in my house there in Champaign, some of the better soil doesn't seem to be there anymore, and that's usually due to land shaping that they do. Sometimes the topsoil's taken up, and it's expensive to move it all off. We do have deep topsoil here, but it's expensive to move it all off and then move it back on.
Define for me, what is the range of depth of topsoils in a natural environment, not in the subdivision maybe, but maybe out, in the hitherlands here, some of the small towns, the agricultural areas, what is that depth range?
Well, I think, what would you say, Howard? Probably 12 inches would be fairly typical here. And when we talk about the topsoil, you can see it there on the mollisol picture behind you. That's one that's got some depth to it, but it still has a color change as you go down. What exactly we call the topsoil traditionally was sort of what the plow would turn up.
Right.
Anymore, it's really what we would consider that's reasonably productive and looks somewhat like the surface soil. And in this part of Illinois, 12 inches, some's 15, some's a little less than that, but as the world goes, that's a pretty nice deep topsoil.
Well, let's talk about that for just a second. In the world, let's say, other places that grow crops, we hear Brazil comes to mind many times, Argentina. Are their soil structures a lot like ours?
Depends a lot on where you are, because the weather is a really important factor in determining how our soils turn out. I've been in Ukraine, and it has a worldwide reputation as having some of the best soils. It does, but there's a reason for that. It's cold and it's dry. And that's a good combination if you want to build soils, not so great if you want to grow crops. Mm-hmm. And the unique thing about Illinois, compared to almost everywhere else in the world, or Illinois and the Midwest here, is that our combination of weather and the parent material from which the soils formed has resulted in this highly productive system that both has good soils and good weather to grow the crops. In parts of South America, they have more rainfall than we do, which can be a good thing, but their soils are generally much, much older, and some of them are severely, we would say, leached. In other words, the water's been running through them so long, there's just not a lot of organic matter and so on that's there. Their temperatures are too high. But if they manage them well, they can still produce good crops there, and that's partly because of people like Howard that know how to make soils produce good crops, even if they don't start out with the best material.
Well, that's what makes East Central Illinois a great place to be involved in agriculture. I want to thank you gentlemen for being with me today to explore soils and how it's important for all of us. I'd like to thank you for listening and hope you tune in again next time when once again we talk about Champaign County agriculture today. I'm your host, Dennis Riggs.
Champaign County Agriculture Today is brought to you by Champaign County Farm Bureau.